Last night, a bullet struck a federal officer in the chest at close range, fired from what the President of the United States described as a powerful gun. The vest held. If it hadn't, this would be a very different video. An armed man opened fire near the security screening area of the White House Correspondents' dinner. Inside, the President, the Vice President, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the FBI Director, and hundreds of journalists and lawmakers. The suspect is alive and in custody, and the motive, the most important fact of all, is still unknown. That last part matters. Unknown does not mean mysterious. It means investigators have not yet publicly established why this happened, whether it was politically motivated, whether the president was the intended target, or whether anyone else was involved. In a moment like this, bad information moves fast. So we are going to separate what is confirmed, what is claimed, and what still cannot be responsibly said. Here is what we know right now. On Saturday night, April 25, 2026, shots were fired outside the ballroom area of the White House Correspondents' dinner at the Washington Hilton in Washington, D.C. President Donald Trump was evacuated. First Lady Melania Trump was safe. Vice President J.D. Vance and other senior officials were also evacuated. The Secret Service says one person is in custody. The Associated Press reports that the suspect was identified by two law enforcement officials as Cole Thomas Allen, 31, of Torrance, California. That identification is important, but it does not explain motive. It does not establish political affiliation. It does not prove a network. And it does not justify the online rush to attach ideology before investigators do. President Trump later addressed reporters at the White House and said the suspect had multiple weapons. He also said one officer was shot at close range with what he described as a powerful gun, but that the officer's vest stopped the round. According to Trump, the vest did the job. That may be the single most important sentence of the night. Because without that vest, this story may have entered a much darker category. The officer survived. The president was not injured. Other protected officials were evacuated. The suspect was taken into custody, but the fact that the incident stopped short of mass casualties does not make it small. It makes the security question sharper. Scene 07. The White House Correspondents' Dinner is not an obscure private gathering. It is one of the most publicly known fixed-location political and media events in Washington. The venue is known. The date is known. The guest list is high-profile. The symbolism is obvious. That means the security model is supposed to assume attention, risk, and planning by hostile actors. This year was especially sensitive because Trump was attending as sitting president after years of open conflict with much of the press, and because this is the same man who survived a gunshot wound to the ear during a 2024 campaign rally. His security detail does not treat threats as hypothetical. They treat them as scheduled. Then, within seconds, a night built around media access, political theater, and public visibility turned into a live security crisis. Inside the ballroom, reporters and guests ducked under tables. Secret Service agents moved quickly. Officers with long guns entered the room. Protected officials were rushed out. The event was first expected to continue, then canceled for the night, with plans to reschedule. That sequence tells you something. The first instinct was to preserve normalcy, but security reality overruled it. And that is the first major question. Was the perimeter strong enough for the concentration of officials inside that building? This was not just a dinner with celebrities and journalists. It included the president, vice president, secretary of state, defense secretary, FBI director, and other senior officials. You do not often get that many national security relevant figures in one publicized room. That does not automatically mean there was a failure. Security systems can work and still face attacks. A suspect can be stopped before reaching the protectee, and in fact, the most generous interpretation is that the protective layer held at the last critical moment. But the less comfortable interpretation is also unavoidable. If an armed man could get close enough to fire near the screening area, close enough for an officer to be struck in the vest, then the question is not whether the system worked in the end, it is whether it should have stopped him sooner. Reports and witness accounts are already circulating about how the suspect approached and what he did before the shooting. Some of that may prove accurate, some will not. Until law enforcement lays out a verified timeline, the most responsible version is also the most honest one. Shots were fired near the screening area, the suspect was stopped, the investigation is active. That is not boring, that is disciplined, and in breaking news, discipline matters more than drama. Trump called the suspect a would-be assassin. That is his characterization. It may eventually match the legal case, it may not. Right now, law enforcement has not publicly established motive. The charges are expected, but the exact legal theory will matter. Was this attempted assassination? Assault on federal officers? Firearms violations? Something else? The paperwork will tell us more than the first political reaction. And this is exactly why the institutional stakes are so high. The Secret Service, the FBI, and the Justice Department are now all under scrutiny at the same time, each for a different reason, and each under enormous political pressure. That pressure will be intense because the country is already polarized. If investigators move slowly, one side will accuse them of hiding information. If they move too quickly, they risk mistakes. If the suspect has a political motive, the consequences will be explosive. If the motive is personal, unstable, or unclear, that too will be weaponized by people looking for a narrative. The safest thing to say tonight is also the most important. Motive is not confirmed. Nationality is not the story unless investigators make it relevant. Background is not motive. Social media posts, if they emerge, are not automatically a manifesto. A name is not a conclusion. This is how false stories are born, by turning fragments into certainty. But uncertainty does not reduce the seriousness. An armed suspect fired near one of the most sensitive political gatherings in the United States. A law enforcement officer was hit. The president was evacuated. The event was shut down. The National Guard and law enforcement flooded the area. That is not routine. That is a major security incident. The location adds historical weight. The Washington Hilton is also remembered as the site where President Ronald Reagan was shot in 1981. That does not make tonight's events identical, but it does mean the Washington Hilton is not just an address. Reagan was wounded leaving the hotel after a speech. Trump was evacuated from inside a dinner after a shooting outside the ballroom area. Different facts, same unsettling reminder. Predictable presidential movements create risk. That is why fixed location events are so challenging. Security teams can harden entrances, screen guests, monitor routes, coordinate with local police, and build layers. But publicized venues create predictable targets. The more famous the event, the more obvious the opportunity. There is an old rule in security. The defender has to be right every time. The attacker only has to find one opening. The key phrase now is layered security. A magnetometer is one layer. A checkpoint is one layer. A perimeter is one layer. Intelligence is another. Crowd control is another. Emergency extraction is another. Tonight, the extraction worked. The immediate response appears to have prevented something worse. But investigators will now ask whether the earlier layers held as they should have. There is also a political layer Trump will not ignore. He framed the incident as proof that intimidation cannot take over society and said the dinner should be rescheduled. That message is meant to project defiance. It also turns the aftermath into a public test. Can the government resume the event without looking reckless? And can it increase security without making Washington look under siege? The White House Correspondents' dinner itself now becomes part of the story. For decades, it has represented a strange Washington ritual. Politicians, journalists, celebrities, jokes, access, ego, and uneasy coexistence between the press and power. Tonight, that ritual collided with the country's age of political violence. The symbolism writes itself, but the facts still have to lead. The most dangerous mistake now would be letting symbolism outrun evidence. Some will use this to attack the press. Some will use it to attack Trump. Some will use it to push gun politics before the basic investigative record is complete. Those debates are coming. But tonight's first responsibility is clarity. What happened, what failed, what worked, and what remains unknown. What worked appears clear. The president and other protected officials were evacuated. The suspect was taken into custody. The wounded officer survived because of protective equipment. The ballroom was cleared. Law enforcement established control. Those are not small things. In a crisis measured in seconds, response speed matters. What remains unclear is the harder side. How did the suspect reach the point where shots could be fired? Were there missed indicators before the event? Were there perimeter gaps? Did the suspect act alone? Did he choose the dinner specifically because Trump was there? Was there prior planning? Did online material point toward motive? Those answers are not public yet. The FBI will now have to build a timeline. That means the suspect's travel, communications, devices, purchases, weapons, online activity, associations, and movements around the hotel. Investigators will reconstruct every step. The public should expect leaks, rumors, partial reports, and conflicting claims. Do not confuse the first detail with the final conclusion. The Justice Department's charges will be the next major signal. Charges do not prove guilt, but they reveal how prosecutors understand the case. If the charges include an attempted assassination framework, that will dramatically raise the legal and political stakes. If the charges focus on firearms and assault, that tells a different story. The language will matter. The Secret Service review may matter even more. If the agency concludes the suspect never breached the core protective zone, officials may argue the system worked. If the review finds perimeter weaknesses, access failures, staffing gaps, or coordination problems, the story shifts from attempted violence to institutional failure. That distinction is everything. And there is a broader pattern that cannot be ignored. Another reported gunfire incident near the White House occurred earlier in April, though with no injuries and no arrest. These events are not necessarily connected, and we should not imply they are. But two security incidents in Washington in the same month will intensify scrutiny over threats against public officials. The United States has been here before in different forms. Presidents threatened, candidates attacked, lawmakers targeted, judges threatened, journalists harassed, public events hardened, and security perimeters expanded. Political violence does not need to succeed to change a country. Sometimes the attempt is enough to alter how leaders move, speak, gather, and govern. That is the deeper issue. Democracy depends on visible leadership. Presidents appear in public. Reporters ask questions. Officials attend events. Political opponents share rooms. Security can protect those spaces, but too much fear can hollow them out. The challenge is to secure public life without turning public life into a bunker. Tonight's incident will also test media responsibility. The people inside that ballroom were not only guests, many were working journalists. They were witnesses, potential victims, and reporters at the same time. That is a difficult position, but it also means the early record will include many direct observations and many emotional, incomplete first impressions. That is why viewers should be skeptical of perfect certainty in the first few hours. The people closest to a crisis often see only fragments. A guest hears shots, a reporter sees agents running, a camera captures one angle, a politician hears one radio call. Each piece matters, but none of them is the whole event. Investigation turns fragments into sequence. For Trump, this will become a defining security moment of his second term. He survived an assassination attempt during the 2024 campaign. Now, as president, he has been evacuated from a high-profile event after a shooting nearby. Those facts will shape how his supporters, critics, and security team interpret the threat environment around him. But again, interpretation is not evidence. The president's history with political violence may shape public reaction. It does not prove tonight's motive. That line has to hold. A country this polarized does not need more people guessing first and correcting later. It needs institutions to establish facts quickly enough to outrun the rumor machine. And if you want this kind of careful breaking news analysis, where facts lead and claims are labeled, subscribe to Signal Drop. And if someone you know is already seeing wild speculation about tonight, send them this video. Because the real answer is still coming, and when it does, we will cover it the same way. The next 24 hours will likely define the public narrative. We may learn more about the suspect. We may see charges. We may hear from the wounded officer. We may get a fuller timeline from the Secret Service. We may learn whether the FBI has found any ideological motive, communications, or planning evidence. Until then, every responsible sentence needs a qualifier. Here are the questions to watch. First, what charges are filed? Second, what motive, if any, do investigators establish? Third, how many weapons were recovered and where? Fourth, how did the suspect approach the screening area? Fifth, did the perimeter function as designed? Sixth, will the dinner really be rescheduled and under what security changes? Also, watch what officials do, not only what they say. A major security review would tell us the agencies see unresolved vulnerabilities. A rapid rescheduling would signal confidence. A heavy new perimeter would signal concern. A narrow criminal complaint would tell one story. A broader federal case would tell another. The response will reveal the assessment. The officer's survival should not be treated as a footnote. Protective equipment did exactly what it was designed to do. That matters. But it should also remind everyone how close the system came to a worse outcome. A vest stopping a round is success. A shooter getting close enough for that round to matter is the part investigators now have to explain. This incident is not yet fully understood. It may become an assassination case. It may become a security failure case. It may become a story about one armed man and a famous target-rich event. It may become something broader if investigators find links or motive. Right now, the only honest answer is that the most important facts are still being assembled. What we know is already serious enough. Shots were fired near a room filled with some of the most powerful people in the United States. A law enforcement officer was hit and survived. The president was evacuated. The suspect is alive, in custody, and under investigation. The country now waits for the facts that matter most: motive, method, and whether this was a failure stopped in time or a warning of something larger.